Segment 5, our last segment, was Afghanistan. Is Afghanistan worth it? Fighting in the Korengal Valley cost the lives of 42 Americans, hundreds more wounded, and yet last month it was announced that, we're taping this in May, last month it was announced that Americans had withdrawn from the valley. Here you tell a story, gripping, moving, about the fight for the Korengal Valley, and we just surrendered it. How does that revise your opinions of what took place? How do you respond to that?
I mean, every war, I think, has its Hamburger Hill, its Dunkirk. We lost 30,000 men at Dunkirk. It's hard to reconcile that. We still won the war. Every war has its Restrepo, the outpost that I spent off and on a year at. I mean, war is...
And that was eventually overrun. It was overrun before you got there, sorry.
Well, it was given up. It was given up.
Right,
they pulled out of the valley. War is incredibly complicated, and it's changing every day, and the strategy changes because the enemy's strategy changes. Before the Americans pulled out of the Korengal, the Taliban, they didn't cease operations, but they were drastically reduced. The amount of fighting in the Korengal dropped tremendously in the previous year. And both sides moved on, and that happens, I think, in every war. I think emotionally it's very hard for the soldiers. But in terms of a strategy, the commanders, I think, are saying, look, we don't have enough men, we don't have enough resources, and the 150 men who are in the Korengal are better used elsewhere.
You write of a Lieutenant Colonel Bill Ostland, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, quote, he had such full-on enthusiasm for what he was doing that when I was around him, I sometimes caught myself feeling bad that there wasn't an endeavor of equivalent magnitude in my own life. It wasn't the war per se that he was so fired up about so much as the whole idea that America was actually over there trying to put Afghanistan back together. Were you responding to his enthusiasm because it was so catching, or were you really responding to the idea that he had of putting Afghanistan back together? In other words, were you at some level on board with the program?
I think both. I mean, I've been going to Afghanistan since 1996. It's a country I really care about tremendously. I was there in the 90s. It was a bloodbath. And if NATO pulls out, it's going to go back to that. And that's a very, very painful thought for me to contemplate.
Bloodbath meaning who's killing whom if we pull out?
There was a civil war in Afghanistan in the 90s that was stopped by the toppling of the Taliban after 9/11. So the level of suffering by the civilian population of Afghanistan now is greatly reduced compared to what it's been for the past 20 years in that country. And, I don't think the Afghans are particularly fond of the Americans, who wants to have foreign troops wandering around their country. But I think most of them are pretty terrified of the prospects if the world pulls out. And so out of concern for Afghanistan, I'm kind of on board in that sense because the stakes are very high for the Afghan people that this work. And but just in terms of knowing Bill Ostland, Colonel Bill Ostland, he just had such incredible enthusiasm, it was hard not to sort of be awed by it and sort of infected by it.
Sebastian, 2.5 or 3 weeks ago, the man sitting in that chair was Fuad Ajami, Middle East expert at Johns Hopkins University, supporter of the Iraq War, in fact, received a medal from President George W. Bush, not a supporter of the Afghan war. To my surprise, frankly, I hadn't realized his feelings on that. Point number one that he made is that there is no Afghanistan to put back together. The idea that it was ever a normal country is false. Different regions, different tribes, you got overlays of tribal conflict with this kind of black market that you were talking about earlier, with different, effectively, war chieftains. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to the notion that Lieutenant Colonel Austin was just, there's no country to put back together?
He's totally wrong.
That's wrong?
That's totally wrong. Kabul was the location of the best medical school in all of Asia in the 70s. And before the Soviets came in and destroyed that country and then triggered a civil war that's essentially now still going on, the hippie trail went through Afghanistan. I mean, it was a place that many, many Western visitors went. There are museums, there's ancient monuments that tourists would go to. I mean, it wasn't unified in the sense the United States is unified, but that doesn't mean it was in conflict. It was stable for decades before
functioned,
that.
it was stable.
It functioned. I mean, look, it's a funky place, and that's one of the things that makes it interesting. But
you get funky. Hold on, you've got unpack funky for me. What do you mean by a funky place?
There's tribes and there's nomads and there's all kinds of scenes that look like they're right out of the Bible. If you grew up in Wisconsin, you're going to see, and you go over there, you're going to see things you didn't think you'd ever see.
Okay.
But it was a functioning country, and it was peaceful. It was peaceful enough that people went there in the 60s and 70s regularly. I mean, it was a real tourist destination, and I mean it's sort of adventurous travelers, but people went there. And the Soviet invasion ruined that, and the country is still trying to put itself back together. So in my opinion, he's completely wrong, and it can be done.
It can. Okay, let me give you one more quotation. This is a direct quotation from Fuad Ajami. Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, is a bandit, and the Afghan campaign can't be won. There's nothing to be gained for the United States in Afghanistan. It just doesn't end well.
I mean, he can't see the future any more than I can or you can. I'm sure there are people.
What kind of ending can you see, though? You must posit some happy ending, or you wouldn't be arguing as you are.
I mean, the Western world figured out how to drive the German army out of Europe. Right? They did D-Day. They pushed through France and pushed the Germans back into Germany. If they can do that, there's something like 10 or 20,000 Taliban fighters essentially barefoot in the mountains with AKs. They can probably figure out how to win that fight. I think the problem isn't a military one in Afghanistan. I think it's a political problem in the countries of Europe and the United States. And if they really want to do it like they did in World War II, they can probably figure it out.
And how does one, I'll let you be the journalist who's just watching it all from the outside, how does one put together the political will to do it?
I mean, I'm not in a position to make recommendations on U.S. foreign policy, but every country in Europe has been attacked or has had a near miss from al-Qaeda. Madrid, London, Holland, Italy, France, all of them were the subjects of plots or actually had attacks. I think what drove the United States into Afghanistan was 3,000 dead in New York City on 9/11. I think if those 3,000 dead had happened in Paris, France would be in Afghanistan. I think the world needs to understand that the chaos and violence of Afghanistan can reach out to touch them in the future, in a year, in 10 years, if that country isn't stabilized. It was a rogue state. It was a perfect refuge for an organization like al-Qaeda. There were no extradition treaties. They could hide there. There was a lot of income from poppy. It was a perfect training ground for their fighters. And if we go back to the 90s, we may risk going back to 9/11.
Last question. In this book, you're going back. I'm just giving you my feeling as a reader here. You're going back and forth, trying out different theories for explaining the way the men behave as they do. You use the word courage, and then 3 pages later, you're talking about ways in which they might be genetically programmed. Your objective, making sure the reader understands that you had a video camera, not a weapon, you weren't actually part of the unit, and then a moment or two later, it's clear that you're feeling like one of the men. So let me ask you this as a kind of summary statement. I'm quoting from the book. Heroism is hard to study in soldiers because they invariably claim that they acted like any good soldier would have. Among other things, heroism is a negation of the self. You're prepared to lose your own life for the sake of the others. Close quote. So even though this story takes place in a valley that a month ago the United States gave up on, and even though you're a journalist, do you want to call the men you covered heroes?
Heroes is such a loaded term. The way it's used commonly is really anyone who served. The soldiers themselves draw greater distinctions. Serving on a rear base is very different from serving on a front line, and the soldiers are very aware of those differences. The guys themselves, they wouldn't call themselves heroes, and I don't think I would want to describe them in ways that they don't understand themselves to be. They were very, very brave, and probably their sort of most noble act, I think, was joining in the first place and deciding, look, I didn't serve my country. I've lived my life for myself my entire life. And these guys decided to volunteer, to risk their lives and serve their country. And whether you're for or against the war, that's a noble thing. And I think the real inspiration in this lies in seeing and understanding the profundity of that choice. What happened in the Korangal Valley, they did for themselves. They don't call it courage. And I think that's something that should be respected, the way they describe their own actions. But to join and serve a greater cause, that's a profound thing. And it really, it's something that has affected me a lot to be around.
Sebastian Junger, the author of War, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.